Tuesday, July 30, on the roller coaster with Jesus. Read Mark chapter 5, verses 21 to 24. What characteristics particularly stand out about Jairus? Mark 5, beginning at verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. Religious leaders such as Jairus were not typically friends with Jesus. As we see in Mark 1:22, the people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. And Mark 3, verse 2, some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. And verse 6, then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. And finally, Luke 13, verse 14. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." So it is likely that he is desperate. This desperation is exemplified by Jairus' falling on his knees before Jesus. His plea is understandable to any parent. His daughter is dying, but he has faith that Jesus can help. Without a word, Jesus departs with the Father to go to his home. Read verses 25 to 34 of Mark 5. What interrupts the progress towards Jairus' house? Beginning at verse 25. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet, instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized the power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." The story cuts away to another scene that evokes pity. A woman experiencing 12 terrible years of sickness. This story of Jairus and the woman is the second sandwich story in Mark. In Mark 3:20 to 35, which was covered in lesson 3, we read another one. Let's just read that one quickly. Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, "He is out of his mind." And teachers of the law who came down from Jerusalem said, "He is possessed by Beelzebub. By the prince of demons he is driving out demons." So Jesus called them over to him and began to speak to them in parables. "How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. If a house is divided against itself, that house cannot stand." In this story, the contrasting characters, Jairus and the woman, come to Jesus for help. The woman comes up behind Jesus and touches his clothing. Immediately she is well. But Jesus stops and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" The woman who had been so sick was suddenly well. Yet she feared that Jesus was angry at what had happened. It was a wild ride for her emotions. But Jesus wanted to heal not only her body, but also her soul. Then back to Jairus, and we read this now in Mark 5, verses 35 to 43. While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher any more?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told them, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. It was a wild ride of emotions for the synagogue leader as well. Jesus allowed no one else to go with him, and the parents, except Peter, James, and John. Jesus states that the girl is not dead, but asleep. He casts out all the mourners and goes into the room where the dead girl lay. Taking her hand, he says, "Talitha cum." Mark translates these words, "Little girl, get up." Actually, the word Talitha means lamb, and thus would be a term of endearment for a child in the home. The command to keep things secret is part of the revelation secrecy motif that runs through Mark and points toward who Jesus is, and that ultimately he cannot remain hidden. This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.